Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last day of PolitiFest 2020. I'm Megan, the engagement editor at Voice of San Diego. For those of you who are just joining us, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit investigative news organization committed to holding public officials accountable and giving you, the public, the tools you need to be advocates for the public good. As a nonprofit, we depend on members and donors like you to make our work possible. So thank you for being here today and for your support. Before we get started, I just want to recognize a couple of sponsors. The Google News Initiative for supporting the creation of this virtual event, the College of Arts and Sciences at USD for underwriting all student tickets, the San Diego Foundation for supporting our community conversations, and also thank you to Cox Communications, SDG&E, the Atlantis Group, the City of San Diego Retired Employees Association, City Heights Community Development Corporation, the San Diego County Democratic Party, and Business for Good. If you have questions for our panelists today, you can put those in the chat box below. You can also tweet along using the hashtag PolitiFest2020. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator today, Lorena Hepler, an economy reporter at CalMatters.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning for this conversation on Proposition 22, officially the App-Based Drivers as Contractors and Labor Policies Initiative. That's a mouthful. And at nearly $200 million in total campaign spending, it is now the most expensive ballot measure in modern state history. It revolves around how gig companies that support the measure, Uber, Lyft, Instacart, DoorDash, should have to classify and pay their workers. That might sound familiar to anyone who's followed the conversation around new state law AB 5. In just a minute, we'll begin our discussion with two people that have been very close to these issues for many years in California, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who's the author of AB 5, and David Cruz, Communications Director of the League of United Americans, the director of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, whose chapter has endorsed Proposition 22. But first, we're throwing out a lot of kind of alphabet soup, AB 5, Prop 22, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page, we wanted to show a quick 1-minute video that our team at CalMatters produced on how we got here, and here's the backstory on Prop 22. For California gig workers, the last few years have involved a lot of driving in circles. Uber and Lyft drivers have organized protests and honked their horns over a new state law that was supposed to change how they get paid. Now, they're back in the middle of another big money battle. I'm CalMatters economy reporter Lorena Hepler, and this is what you need to know about Prop 22 in under a minute. California's new labor law was supposed to reclassify thousands of contract workers as employees, giving them higher pay, healthcare, and family leave. But companies like Uber and Lyft haven't complied. They've threatened to shut down and say the law would force them to cut jobs and raise prices. Instead, the gig companies want voters' help rewriting the rules with Prop 22. It would offer workers a few new benefits, but not as many as the state law. Gig companies kicked off their campaign with more than $100 million and have kept adding since. Labor groups are fighting back. They say the pandemic is a prime example of why drivers need the stronger protections of current laws, not this milder alternative. Vote yes on Prop 22 to allow gig companies to limit contractors' benefits. Vote no if you think gig companies should treat and pay drivers like employees. And remember, there are already lawsuits flying over gig worker rules, so it could be a bumpy road to Election Day. For more information on Prop 22 and everything on the November ballot, visit calmatters.org. All right, let's jump right into it. Assemblywoman Gonzalez, I want to start with you. What has it been like to just go in the last year from getting AB 5 passed to now seeing this partial referendum, Prop 22, become far and away the most expensive ballot measure in state history?
I just realized I was muted. So this is the most expensive ballot measure in the United States history because of the app-based companies. They are the ones who have spent over $185 million, more than any side has ever spent on an initiative. The labor has spent far less on this initiative. And it's telling, when billion-dollar companies spend that much money to deny their workers the basic protections under law, and we're talking about things like minimum wage and overtime, the right to unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, things that all of us appreciate and rely on in employment, things that we expect mom and pop companies to provide to their employees. These billionaires basically are funding efforts to rewrite labor laws and rewrite the history or the future of workers in the state.
So David, let's tee this up on your side. Can you tell us a little bit about why your chapter of LULAC is supporting Prop 22?
Well, because I don't talk about minimum wage, I talk about maximum wage. I want to make sure that the independent contractor, who in essence is a business owner, they really are a business owner. They have an opportunity now to get out from under the control. I know the assembly member will describe it as I'm here for their best interest, but when you look at the legislation, what was in AB 5 caused more than 100 exceptions so far. And we've had to come to this point right now because we didn't get an opportunity to have a say in the beginning. Yes on 22 is our first opportunity as voters in California, and there's 20 million of us, and as workers who do this each and every day. And the truth is that 4-1, the drivers are telling us what they want. So I want to thank the drivers who are out there right now. I appreciate you. I love you. We're here because we stand with you on the basic and fundamental civil right of you deciding for yourself how you want to work, when you want to work, and for whom you want to work. And not talk about the minimum wage, but how much can you really put on the table for your family? That's what's important to me.
So let's talk about the pay issue, because that's one of the really big differences between AB 5 and Prop 22. So AB 5 mandate, which is again the current state law, mandates an hourly minimum wage that applies to all workers in California, as well as overtime pay, mileage reimbursement.
5 does not. I just want to be clear. AB 5 doesn't require those things. State law requires those things. Yeah. AB 5 just says if you're doing the work of a company, you have to be treated as an employee and have all these things. Because I want to be clear.
Yes on 22 would enable you to make 120% over minimum wage, which is the only thing that AB 5 has.
Yeah, so let me finish describing the differences. So current state law, you have minimum wage, overtime, mileage reimbursement, and employee benefits like healthcare and paid leave. Prop 22 carves out a different system because they say these are a different type of jobs. We're talking about temporary on-demand work. And so they call for 120% of minimum wage, limited mileage reimbursement, healthcare subsidies based on the number of hours you work, and a few other things like accident protection and new driver background screening. But that's all tied to what they call engaged time. And that excludes the wait time between rides or deliveries, which studies by groups like Cornell and UC Berkeley, which are backed by both business and labor groups, estimate at about 28 to 33% of drivers' time. So, David, please, can you pick that up and sort of what
Absolutely.
is that different in pay?
No, and thank you. Thank you for allowing me that opportunity. The study points out that if you have a driver who does about 5 hours a week, even with the time that they're not engaged, and you look at expenses, they will make $25.61 an hour. That's with 5 hours. And as far as the health benefits are concerned, what part-time job in California really does provide for those kinds of health benefits? I'll tell you what this does. Yes on 22, after 15 hours, we'll pay 1/2 of the healthcare stipend. And after 25 hours a week, you get the entire $367 a month to use any way you want. If your spouse or significant other has coverage, you don't have to put it there. You can use that money any way you wish. But when you look at the total picture, for these business owners who are really their own boss, they get a chance to decide what they want to do with their time. And this is really, Lauren, my final point, this is about control. The control needs to be in the hands of the drivers, not Sacramento. They're not looking out for their interests. They see a new group that they can go and organize because it benefits them. But what really this is about, and this is what's in the actual voter guide, I would ask our viewers, the people, go and see what's on Yes on 22. Everything else is extraneous. Thank you.
Assemblywoman Gonzalez, what's your response?
Well, there were so many falsehoods in everything said, but I think I'll start with what you said, which was right. About 30% of the driver's times goes unpaid for. So this 120% doesn't even include a basic minimum wage. In fact, the University of California at Berkeley did a study deconstructing how much people would make under this new law. They'd make about $5.64 an hour after expenses. That's not even minimum wage. And that's what we're talking about here. A study out of UCLA says 1 in 5 rideshare drivers have to rely on public aid. These are taxpayer subsidized public aid. They're not making $25 an hour. And they're paying for the expenses on their car, their mileage. About half of these rideshare drivers struggle to even make those expenses because they need the immediate cash. The flexibility argument Sacramento doesn't require anything as far as how many hours you work, who you work for. In fact, there's laws that protect workers in order to work for multiple companies. It's always in the hands of the companies how much flexibility there is. So these companies have always been able to say, yeah, we'll let you drive with complete flexibility. You can decide or not. You get paid when you're on the app or not. You decide, obviously you can't drive when there's no rides available. So that flexibility argument is a little bit stale. As far as other benefits, I love this argument because it's like, well, healthcare and these part-time drivers. Well, 50% of these drivers drive at least 35 hours. That was according to the UCLA study, independent study of the drivers. In California, that would actually mean you get full healthcare, not $300 a month, which is, their healthcare plan hasn't been really explained in its entirety. And I would say this, if these companies wanted to provide additional benefits, wanted to provide more pay, they could have over the last 10 years. And instead, they've continued to cut the workers' pay. This has never been about the workers. The workers aren't paying $180 million to exempt themselves out of basic labor protections. And it's not just healthcare. In California, part-time workers get the right to unemployment insurance. How many of these drivers had to go out during the pandemic because there was no work available and they had no protections under previous laws? They did have unemployment insurance protections because we passed AB 5. These drivers don't have a right to paid sick days or paid family leave, things that we actually require, yes, of part-time employers in the state of California. Workers' compensation if they get hurt on the job. This is one of the most dangerous jobs there are in California. You can imagine you're driving full-time. Workers' compensation picks up the cost for those if you get injured on the job and the effect of that.
Well, if I may interject a word or two, may I take a breath there? Maybe let me say something to you. The pandemic really is the enemy.
Let's let the assemblywoman, and then I have okay, we're good. Yeah, go ahead, David. I was going to ask you both about the pandemic, so please continue.
The pandemic, I agree. The pandemic is the enemy. Look, we've seen a drop off in the economy, 60 to 70%, and we're all being impacted by it. I've been impacted. I've been hunkered down like a lot of other people. And let me say that with all respect to the assembly member, she can do something about PPE. She could make sure that California provided that to every single worker in California, but she hasn't done that. The assembly hasn't done that. They want to put the onus on someone else. They have the ability to do that, but instead they'll legislate and hope somebody else will take care of it. The so-called study done by Berkeley, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on numbers because the average person cares about their freedom. The Labor Center at Berkeley is comprised of labor luminaries. I respect them. They have a place in California. I think they're doing a great job. But on this particular issue, I don't have full faith in that study. I would come back and say this to you, that they are business owners who have the opportunity to pick for themselves how they wish to work. And there is a consistent earning level that will be guaranteed with Yes on 22 of at least 120% over minimum wage. There's nothing with an AB 5 beyond the minimum. But let me conclude with this. Flexibility, they say, is a stale issue. Well, let's think about this. If I work for an employer, is that employer going to give me, the student, time to simply go and do my studies or go home and take care of a sick child or take care of some other family issue that I must, or maybe go across the street if I work at Starbucks and go maybe pour a cup of coffee at Pete's? The reality is that in the real world, the assembly member knows in the real world, and that's where I live as a business owner, flexibility is so important because I've got to plan on my staffing.
So let's drill into those numbers that have been thrown out. So on the low end for pay estimates, we have the Berkeley Labor Center, which is connected to groups like Gig Workers Rising, saying that the drivers would end up after Prop 22 making about $5.64 an hour. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a group at UC Riverside that was commissioned by Lyft and estimates that drivers could earn up to $27 an hour. And the big differences there are how they calculate that wait time that is exempted from the pay and the expenses that drivers are reimbursed for. I will note that the Legislative Analyst's Office in the language describing Prop 22 says that most drivers make between $11 and $16 an hour after accounting for expenses and mileage. So that's another data point to consider in this kind of scramble that we have going on. But Assemblymember, I did want to ask you about just kind of this point in time. Obviously, things have changed for all of our day-to-day realities with the pandemic and the fact that we are now in this recession. Does that in any way change the context for you of how we should think about regulating companies that employ people in this state?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic has shown us, just like the recession showed us previously, that things like unemployment insurance have never been more important. You know, he brought up, will a company allow you to take care of your sick child? Guess what? In state law, they have to. That's one of the things that we have insisted. In fact, one of the things we were working on in the legislature. And in fact, we have both paid and job protected leave to take care of loved ones that are sick during a pandemic like this. Workers' compensation, when you can actually get COVID on the job or any other disease or get hurt on the job. How important is that? Well, I'll tell you what, people don't really think about until they need it. But once they need it, it's pretty damn important. These are just some of the basics that are covered through employment law. California has some of the strongest employment law in the nation, if not the strongest. We have some of the best protections. And what we are seeing now from these companies, and there's a reason they're spending $180 million, because they know they're getting off cheap if they can pass this initiative. They will not be passing on the profits to their workers, the people actually making the profits. This is one of those work situations where the drivers are doing all of the work. They're taking on all of the risk. They're expending themselves all of the time. Yes, 30% of their time unpaid under this proposition. And yet Uber and Lyft, of course, that works for the executives. They're becoming billionaires as their drivers are sleeping in their cars and losing those cars because they've also rented them out their cars. It is a crazy idea of how work should be in the future. If that's what we're agreeing to, I think all of our employment procedures are at risk.
I would
like to clarify something. The Assembly member knows that if yes on 22 does not pass, we're going to have fewer workers in California. There's no guarantee with an AB 5 that mandates how many workers companies must keep. So we do see that there's a lot at stake. This is a state of 40 million residents, 20 million voters, 10 media markets. There is a great deal at stake here. This is the future of how we're going to work in America, and flexibility is the key. Workers' comp, you know, Assembly member, that within yes on 22, there is up to $1 million for injuries that are suffered on the job. There's a 66% on disability of all combined platform income that will be applied. And there's even a death benefit, God forbid something happens. So indeed, I agree with you. There is a lot at stake. And that's why instead of the misinformation, we ought to stick to what's on the yes on 22 measure itself. And it does provide those protections.
Do you have a response?
Accident insurance is not workers' compensation, and to suggest so is so dishonest. It's incredible. But David said it. He said, yes, this is the future of work in the United States. Well, I really hope not. Why are we working so hard for things like paid family leave if you're never going to be able to have it? Because you know what? You're on your own. That's what the future of work is, that maybe you'll have a benefit, maybe you won't. It'll be completely up to a company to decide because, hey, you're an entrepreneur. We're going to innovate work by taking away all the benefits we've worked so hard for. By the way, let's talk about
we're not the enemy. We're not the enemy here, Assembly member. You know, business is what feeds the economy of California. Innovators are the job creators. We're not the job killers. We're here to create work. And by the way, that comes with risk. How much risk do you take in Sacramento to create jobs? If you're cutting deals with special interests that come to you and deny us an opportunity to have a say, all the workers asked for was listen to them. The overwhelming majority of the drivers have said, no, we want to stay independent. We want to be our own business owners.
All right. I've got one question here, because one thing that I thought was interesting in preparing for this event, we're talking about business, we're talking about legislators. We did ask for one of the companies that have supported Prop 22 to join us for this conversation, and they all declined to make a chief executive or a policy executive available. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, how productive is it to have conversations like these when the companies that are supporting the measure aren't participating in the conversation as directly? And I'm curious for you specifically, Assemblywoman Gonzalez, do you have direct communication with an Uber, a Lyft, an Instacart, or how do you make policy if there isn't that direct line of communication?
I spoke with executives from those companies all last year during this, and all they wanted was an exemption. And when it was clear that I was unwilling to do an exemption, I said, let's talk about what your business model looks like. Let's talk about how much basic protections should cost. They absolutely refused. Their idea, they kept saying, they use a lot of code words. They use portable benefits, for example. So we got in a large discussion about portable benefits. That's the future. Well, our first and foremost portable benefit is Social Security and Medicare. That costs 7.5% by the employee and 7.5% by the employer. That's how we all get contributed into this fund that no matter where we go work still exists for us, right? I said, let's start there, 7.5%. They said, no, we want to give 3% into a portable benefits fund that the worker can choose how to use it. It might be Social Security, it might be health care, it might be paid leave or sick days. 3.5%, 3% I think is what the highest that they ever got to. And minimum wage, that's what they were willing to pay. People can't live off of that. Our taxpayer dollars cannot subsidize enough employees if they're being paid that. And I would say, I'm a little offended by David's accusations about what we're trying to do here, because I'll remind you of this. There is no guarantee under this proposition that these jobs will continue to be there. In fact, if you look at the filings of the SEC from Uber, they talk extensively about moving to driverless cars. Their goal is to get to a point to completely remove employees from the equation. To suggest that we're not demanding a certain level of employees at a company, we can't. That's not. But there is nothing in AB
I understand.
or Prop 22. In fact, if you look at these very companies, their goal is to get rid of employees. Their goal has been to get rid of public transit. Their goal has been to get rid of taxi cabs. So if you talk about who's getting rid of actual jobs in the future of work, it's these companies. It's not state law.
Well, you love to use Twitter, and I know that you may not realize this, but Twitter put my industry out of business because until then, politicians like you had to pay to reach the public. Now you do it free. But did you know how many workers you displaced? And you live on that platform. That's a use of technology. I don't begrudge you for doing that. That is the way of the future. As a matter of fact, none of us would be here if it were not for this technology to be able to speak to each other. So I don't think it's about you versus me versus you. It's about really what's going to make these companies successful. And guess what? The people who are making them successful are their customers. They're the ones who want competitively priced services. They're the ones who want that driver to come deliver their medication and to bring them the things that they need at home. Here's what I don't want to have happen, Lauren and Assemblymember Gonzalez. What I don't want to have happen is that my neighbor next door, they're in their 70s and they rely on these door delivery systems to have to wait or not have the service because I don't live in a mega city like LA, I'm outside in the agricultural community. I do look at that. I look at how are we going to keep this infrastructure moving, and I don't begrudge. Big is not bad, because if big was bad, Assembly member, think of how many organizations you represent who have been very successful and represent a lot of people who, by the way, don't depend on Social Security. They have their own retirement fund, a retirement fund that gives them 3 or 4 times what I will ever make in the private sector. You have contributed to creating a dual system in California. And it's not the rich and the poor. It's the people who have someone like you who shills for them versus someone who is out here trying to make a living. And that's what these drivers are doing. They're out there right now trying to make a living. And they'll work however many hours it takes to be able to put food on the table. I want them to have that choice. Wouldn't you like to have the same choice for them that you want for you? Let them decide. I'm not going to make that choice.
Assemblywoman Gonzalez, do you have a response to that comment in particular?
Well, look, I thought this was going to be about Prop 22, not an ideological discussion about unions and rights of workers in general. There's a lot that could be said. One, there's this number thrown out all the time by this gentleman said 1 of 5 or 4 or 5, 40%, I don't know how many drivers they say want to be independent contractors. That's amazing, given the thousands of drivers who have already left the system and those who have filed for wage theft since AB 5 has passed. And their numbers come from, and we've all seen it now, right? Anyone that uses Uber or Lyft as a customer or driver now sees that in order to engage the app, you have to say you understand and support Prop 22. This is some incredible control that these app companies are putting over their drivers. And so, we saw that throughout, this doesn't come from my beliefs. We had rideshare drivers, we had delivery drivers at every single hearing in the Capitol testifying for AB 5 because of the condition that they're in. They know that they need more. And we have to provide basic protections, because if those aren't provided by the employer, then us as taxpayers provide that in California. And let me give you a couple of examples of what happens if Prop 22 passes. Number one, we already know 1 in 5 rideshare drivers have to rely on public aid. That's things like CalFresh, CalWorks. That's things like subsidized housing, Section 8 housing, free lunch for their kids. All of that continues to be paid by taxpayers, because while these companies have billions of dollars. They actually started this pandemic by saying they had $11 billion in cash they're sitting on. They're sitting on that cash, but refusing to pay basic protections for their workers. So we as taxpayers have to funnel that. Let's talk about another thing, unemployment insurance. These companies have not paid into the unemployment insurance fund. What does that mean? That means just Uber and Lyft, not the other app-based companies, owe our state $413 million from the past 4 years. $413 million. All right. What does that mean? We all know, or hopefully we heard, our unemployment insurance fund is underfunded. So we had to go to the federal government and request a loan. We got that loan. We were the first state that had to do this. This isn't the first time we had to do this during the recession as well. That loan will become due in 2 years. And then who pays for it? Law-abiding companies who have paid into unemployment insurance and will continue to pay in, now are going to be paying the fair share of Uber and Lyft, who said, oh, we're not responsible. We can pay to exempt ourselves out of this responsibility. So every time that these people who, by and far, look, we're talking about people who become billionaires, the individual CEOs and CFOs who won't come on here have actually become billionaires from these companies. And yet we are paying, and law-abiding companies pay, and you and me as taxpayers pay their fair share. Tell me how that is sustainable in a state or a country.
I want to get back into some of the numbers about what we do know about the impact of Prop 22. And in the meantime, I just wanted to say, if you have questions, we're covering a lot of ground very quickly. If you have questions about specific things we're talking about, please feel free to submit them. We will take open Q&A from the audience in about 10 minutes. But when it comes to data, what Uber has said in particular, their own economists, they forecast a 76% decline in the number of drivers that would be active on their app, and up to a 25 to 111% increase in ride fares if they have to comply with current state law. But in other states like New York City that have implemented a minimum wage for ride-hailing drivers, which is admittedly narrower in scope than California's own labor laws, so far we've seen a 5 to 10% increase in fares, and driver pay is up 10%. David, I'm curious, as a business owner yourself, what's sort of your reaction to that kind of math that companies are doing right now, and what's likely to actually play out?
Please, for the record, I'm not one of those billionaires, okay, guys? I mean, I do this as a volunteer, and I'm here because I've talked to these drivers, and I know what they're going through. And by the way, sleeping in their cars, that doesn't just happen to people who drive for a ride share. It's happening to many different industries. Let's be honest about it. It's not Uber or Lyft that started that. It's this stupid pandemic we're all having to deal with. But I want to come back to your question. I know what it is to go through these kinds of regulations. When I had my own business and I had my own storefront business, the first 9 to 10 to 11 days a month, I was paying for things, and I'm not begrudging what you need to do for your workers. They are very core to a business. But I was paying for a lot of regulations and things that went way beyond what I could afford as a business. And in the end, we ended up shuttering the business. My concern here is that when you give politicians in Sacramento a chance to see a new tax opportunity, they will take it. And I don't I don't blame them. That's their job, I suppose. But maybe we should be asking the drivers if they can make 25.61 on up, since you asked me about numbers, which would they rather have? Minimum wage or the ability to make more money, the ability to work for any number of apps, the ability to work however many days and take whatever customers they want. Now, I will say for the record, Assembly Member, that I'm a 5-star writer for these companies because I like to give them 20, 25% no matter what. I love what they do. They're important. What I don't want to have happen is that we regulate to the point where we drive them out of business. And then what are we going to say to them? We thought we could make these companies work for us, but it turned out that they can't. And since the Assembly Member brought up the fact that technology is moving forward, how do we legislate not letting them one day come up with these autonomous cars? I don't know what I'm going to do, but at that point, we'll have to deal with it. That is the future. And the theme of our being here together is how do we figure this out together? They're not adversaries. We ought to be able to work with them.
So Assemblywoman Gonzalez, last year when the conversation around AB5 was going on, there was a lot of talk about whether that measure would be a bellwether for the rest of the country and workers in other places. And now there's a similar conversation happening around Prop 22. Could this be sort of a change in those headwinds? How do you think about what happens in California and how that could impact workers elsewhere?
Before I jump to that, I just want to correct something. The state law, first of all, minimum wage, can vary depending what city you're in, obviously, but it's going to be at $15 an hour, plus requires 58 cents a mile, 58 cents a mile on expenses that are being placed on that car. So these drivers will get far more than a minimum wage, if you will, because their expenses will be paid for. That's what they don't have now. And so while they may make $20 or plus the tips, the other thing on tips is just a point on these companies. Yes, I enjoy tipping my driver too. And I'm able to do that because I wrote the law to require Uber to allow for tips. Uber did not allow for tips, and we had to do it legislatively. We ended up pulling back the law because they agreed to do that. But that's just a point of what these companies are about. They're about their business model, their control. They're about making money for their executives and not worrying about what's best for their drivers. So my experience with these companies is long, and they have had to be pushed the entire time to even be as fair as they are today. Even any protections they're getting under Prop 22, if it should pass, are only there because we pushed them. I mean, they are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They have fought us on every single protection for drivers, and that is my job. I hope we have national regulations and national laws being looked at currently. It depends on who wins the presidency and what's going to happen to the gig economy. I think that's clear. It depends on what happens to the president to determine what's going to happen at the National Labor Relations Board, which has some crazy ideas about employment. Whether or not we can pass something like the PRO Act, whether we can ensure that rideshare drivers and all gig workers are protected, and more than that, the future of work in general. This is an honest question we should all ask. Just because you're hired through an app, does that mean that you've given up the right to every workplace protection we fought so hard for? Because that is where these companies would like to go. All of these companies. How many times have you heard it's the Uber of bartenders? It's the Uber of stocking shelves. These are good middle-class jobs that are being decimated because suddenly we've got to have an on-demand economy that provides no protections for the workers and only provides profits for the executives and corporations who aren't paying their fair share in taxes either. This is not sustainable. That's why income inequality continues to expand. That's why the richest 1% continue to get richer. And that's why our schools and our roads are underfunded. We can't have this. And so, yes, I absolutely hope we have a discussion about the future of work, and that includes the future of workers and protected workers for anyone that requires or is willing to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week, should not have to rely on public services. They should be able to put a house over their head. They should be able to put food on the table and send their kid to college.
So you talk about the big picture for income inequality. One other thing I wanted to talk about in this race in particular is the role of race and ethnicity. Both the yes and no on 22 campaigns have focused on the fact that the majority of drivers, upwards of 3/4, some estimates say, are people of color. And groups like the ACLU say that gig companies could further exploit non-white workers. But groups like yours, David, say that this industry is a source of income that's more accessible than jobs may have historically been. Can you talk about your position on that?
Well, the way you premised your question, I think, presumes that if someone is coming into this space, they're going to be exploited. I think that's a false premise. But that aside, let me just come to the point.
No, I said that's the ACLU's position, to be clear.
The job training in California, programs that could help these workers maximize their benefits, get additional income saved as they file their taxes lawfully, legally. I would invite the assembly member to work with us, to sit with these workers and to make better use of some of those educational and training dollars that can truly reach the working people in the state of California. I don't believe that this is going to be about mass exploitation of workers. It's given people who have been twice the rate infected by COVID an opportunity to put food on their table, irrespective of immigration status. They have the protection of the UNRRA Act. So to go out there into the public space and to say every company that's successful is my enemy, I don't want to carry that kind of a load. I want to stand with the drivers who are saying repeatedly, we want to decide for ourselves how we drive, when we drive, and for how much. That's where I think this measure ought to go. And this is why I'm inviting the people who are tuned in. And that's why I'm here. I'm here because of you, the people who will vote. I would invite you to go out and read what's on the Yes on 22 ballot and the measure and the description and the Legislative Analyst's Office report and decide for yourselves what's really in the best interest of the worker. Is it someone else having control, or is it you deciding for yourself how you want to spend your time and get paid for it?
Assemblywoman Gonzalez, was this consideration about how workers of different races or ethnicities are impacted by legislation a key factor when you were thinking about AB 5? And do you think it's still relevant now with Prop 22?
Absolutely. We know that Latinos in particular and African Americans have a higher rate of misclassification, extensively higher rate of misclassification than white workers. We know that they occupy the fields where misclassification is in fact the biggest problems. We know that the ability to be an employee, to have benefits, to rely on Social Security is the difference between being in poverty for workers of color and being able to get by. And beyond that, the right to collectively bargain, and that we haven't talked about. If you take away the right of these workers to be employees, they'll never have the right to join a union. They'll never have the right to collectively bargain. And what does that mean? Well, for Latinos, the difference is 40%. 40% in pay for Latinos who are in a unionized job versus the same Latinos who are in a non-unionized job. That's a lot of money. We know that giving workers the right to collectively bargain is ultimately the golden ticket for workers to get out of poverty. And that's an important feature. Now, that's up to the workers. That's not something that's imposed on them by AB 5. That's not something we could impose on them, but they should have the right to choose that. And as independent contractors, they'll never have the right to choose that. We know that pay equity issues can't be addressed with independent contractors, and Latinas face the highest pay inequity problems in the state. We make on average 44 to 52 cents a dollar of our white male counterpart. That can only be addressed through employment legislation, and that is not currently being addressed. And so, yes, when it comes to misclassification, when it comes to exploiting workers, absolutely, some of the reason we do this is because Black and Latino workers who find themselves in the worst possible situation, not just during the pandemic, we're seeing them also face health issues during the pandemic, but overall, Latino workers are twice as likely not to have health insurance. What happens during a pandemic when you're forced to drive because you can't even qualify for unemployment insurance? So you're forced to put yourself and your family at risk. You get COVID, you don't have workers' compensation, you don't have paid leave, you don't have health care. What happens to that driver? I'll tell you, we've had those drivers. Some of them have died. Others have gone bankrupt trying to even get by. That is not the future of workers in California, definitely not the future of workers of color, at least not as long as I'm here.
So this subtext about the ability of workers to organize is something that's certainly come up in a lot of interviews I've done with drivers that are not affiliated with either campaign, and some very much are interested in longer term being able to negotiate their commissions, like taxi drivers have done in the past. And others very much do say, David, like you're saying, I want this to be flexible, I'm part-time. Is there a viable alternative to collective organizing for these drivers? Because one thing that's in Prop 22 is a 7/8 sort of lock-in requirement. It's an unusually high bar to amend the measure later. So lawmakers wouldn't be able to make changes as easily. As my colleagues at CalMatters have said, it might be politically impossible in California. So what's your response there on sort of the recourse that workers would have with Prop 22?
Well, the default under state constitution is that you cannot change an initiative statute that's driven by the voters. And yes, it is a high bar. This is a very serious matter. We want lawmakers in Sacramento to respect the will of the people. We speak about misclassification of workers. We talk about farm workers. I would remind the assembly member, she knows and I know that this has been going on since the 60s. And you know, this is a state that likes to say, including elected officials, we're here for you. But why haven't they taken care of the problem in 40, 50, 60 years? Why haven't they? I mean, they've had that opportunity. So rather than laugh about it, I would challenge her to say, look, let's work together. Business is not an enemy. As a matter of fact, we're trying to make ends meet with the legislation that's being created in Sacramento. And I would remind the assembly member that we elected you to represent us, and the wishes of the voters is all that we are asking be respected on 22. We can improve it, we can advance it, but the 7/8 is for a reason, so that Sacramento cannot undo the will of the voters. AB 5 does not reflect that.
With all due respect, I don't know exactly what happened in the 1960s. I wasn't alive. My father was in Mexico. I don't have that personal firsthand knowledge. I'm sorry.
Well, I do.
But I will tell you this. I've been in the legislature for 7 years, and every single one of them.
And I've been in civil rights for 43 years, and if longevity were proof of wisdom, I would be the wisest guy here, but it's not. You know what? I think we ought to work together. We ought to work together.
Let's Assemblywoman respond, please.
What I'm saying is, he said, why haven't legislators done anything? And I would challenge you with this. I've been in the legislature only 7 years, not very long. And every single one of those years, I have committed myself to making things better for workers, in particular, Latino workers and female workers and women of color who face these obstacles at work, who face massive income inequality, who face misclassification and wage theft every single year. I've successfully passed legislation that helps workers. So to somehow suggest that there aren't elected officials who are committed to that, I think is disingenuous, to say the least. And I'm sorry, I got so distracted by this knowledge that somehow there's a bigger problem here, right? We'll never really be able to know what would have happened in an honest debate. It's pretty hard to have a true debate about a ballot initiative when one side is spending $181 million. I mean, it's hard to get a word in edgewise. I'm having a hard time today getting my word in edgewise. But this
I think you're doing great. I think you're doing great.
Let's let her keep going. We are starting to get audience questions. Keep them coming, by the way. But Assembly member, please continue.
But, you know, the truth is this. We have to look at the future of workers and what we're going to expect and how we're going to fund our programs that we're going to have to expand, public aid programs, because the workers under this proposition and under the future of Uber and Lyfts of the world will not be able to make ends meet. And that's a problem.
Lauren, let me say that I do want to work with these companies to invest more in California, Assembly member, but I don't want to put it in the pockets of union leaders. Here's where I want to put it. I want to put it into the school funds of our school districts to teach our kids who are in STEM and STEAM how to become designers of these technology systems and how to truly move forward, so that the son or daughter of a migrant worker or an immigrant who comes here and within one generation can be in Sacramento, so that they too can benefit from this American experience. That's where I want these companies to go, investing into the future of the next generation. That is what I am here for, job creation, no other agenda. I'm not a politician, never played one on TV. I simply want to see more investment of money going into the future of our families. That's where I want it to go, including some of those profits.
So,
And
okay, so
I just want to be clear, there's not a dollar that goes into a union leader's pocket from AB5. There's not a dollar from employment.
Well, I don't know where you pay the dues. The dues do go to your income.
Well, first of all, when workers elect to be in a union, yes, that's a different issue. Nothing in AB5 requires a worker to be in a union.
Well, you brought up organized labor. I was talking about yes on 22. What's in the ballot? That's really what this is about.
But you said money going into labor leaders' pockets, and I want to be clear that
if these companies are going to come forward to make an investment in California,
I think we've gone down this road. I think we're not going to settle the question of how labor organizing impacts job creation and job training, but we are getting some very concrete questions from voters, so I want to go to those. So if app-based drivers are classified as employees, is gas and other expenses on their car paid for? Assemblymember, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. That's the law in California. If you're an employee, you get about 58 cents per mile. I think that's the current IRS reimbursement rate. That's for gas plus wear and tear. You get your cell phone paid for. I mean, your expenses as an employee is paid for. And so that goes on top of at least a minimum wage for every single hour worked.
The question would be how many employees keep their job, or how many drivers would keep their job, Assemblymember?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Uber and Lyft have thrown out different numbers every time, and that's proven not to be true where they've been forced to actually do.
Can you guarantee how many would keep jobs?
David, I have to ask since your group has endorsed Prop 22, do you have a sense of the job estimates after?
Yes. We see a layoff of somewhere between 900 and 950,000 people in the state of California. The largest single layoff in the history of California.
Is that a combined number?
We've talked to the companies. We've talked to these companies. If you take these companies and you say to them, you're only going to be able to operate this way, that's the projection that we're looking at. From 900 to 950,000 people. You can scoff at it, but I would ask the assembly member, what guarantee is there in AB5? How many people are going to keep their work? It sounds great, but is it spelled out? Is it somewhere guaranteed under law? It isn't. Whereas yes on 22 spells out in writing every single feature that these drivers can rely on, Lauren.
Can I just note that apparently there's going to be more layoffs than there are actual drivers in California under this opportunity. I don't even know what to call it, this projection. And I would hope and suggest a respected organization like LULAC National has not put out that number, because there are not 995,000 individual gig drivers in California.
I'm president of the LULAC Business and Economic Council. I'm here as a volunteer. This is the data that we've been able to gather.
Yeah, so just to clarify, what is that estimate? Is that from the Yes on 22 campaign? Is that from the companies providing data?
It is company data that's been provided that I've researched between 900 and 950,000 jobs. Now, of course, I haven't looked at the actual ledgers, so could that be wrong? No more so than what AB5 is projecting, but those are the numbers that I have, and that's what I'm presenting.
That is another thing I wanted to ask about, just in sort of how you think about making policy that could impact a lot of people, Assemblymember Gonzalez, because the data in this case on how many drivers are logged into a platform on a given day, how many hours they work, and things like the wait time in between rides are all held by the companies in this instance. So is that a challenge for legislators to overcome, or how do you deal with that?
Well, of course, that's always hard when companies won't share the data, and they've been unwilling to. There have been independent studies done both by UC Berkeley Labor Center as well as UCLA in having actual discussions with actual drivers. They've had to go out and get that data themselves. That continues to be, I think UC Santa Cruz just did a similar study. So academics have been able to reach some conclusions that are far contrary to what these companies will put out. What we do, and this is often like when I wrote AB5, one of the things we relied heavily on is the data at the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the data at EDD, how many misclassified workers have been found through audits in California. We relied upon the lawsuits, the hundreds of thousands of workers throughout California who have filed lawsuits for misclassification and have basically won rights through that. So we have to rely on actual outcomes, and we can't rely on the words of these companies. I have never seen a number like 950,000 workers being affected by this. And I think that we could pretty much show, and I'd be happy to move, that there aren't 950,000 workers who today especially are driving during this pandemic. So, that is just an outrageous, enormous amount of suggestion. In fact, when we wrote AB 5, we were told that there were maybe 1 million to 1.5 million individuals who filed a 1099 in California. That includes doctors, lawyers, freelance writers, beauty salon workers. I mean, that includes construction workers, janitorial workers, everybody in the entire sphere. So, I get it. That this is problem, but let's work in reality and numbers that actually would ever make sense.
In terms of, okay, so for a couple data points we do have in the lawsuits that are going on right now over whether the gig companies should have to immediately comply with AB 5 and current state law. Uber has said that they had 209,000 drivers in California as of last year. The gig companies collectively say that hundreds of thousands of workers could be impacted by Prop 22 and what happens with state law. So that's just an editorial note. We do have a couple other questions. And one of them is, if Prop 22 fails, will we see more AB 5 rideshare exemption efforts in subsequent elections? Does anyone have a guess on what happens if the measure fails?
I don't write the law. I live by it. I have to live under what they do. I can tell you this, AB 5 has no guarantees in terms of what's going to happen in the future. All we're trying to do is to figure out a way to navigate these waters with a changing reality. And we're not going to stop technology. Whether we like it or not, it's coming. And how we adapt to it and how we educate our children to live with it and benefit from it and leverage it and help design it, that's where we can have an impact. And that's what I'm about.
Assemblywoman, do you expect more exemptions or challenges?
I expect big corporate interests to consistently use the ballot box in an initiative process in California. As we've seen in the history, the last 10 years, I don't know how many of these initiative fights I've been part of to try to deprive workers of basic rights. That seems to happen quite often. That's their only method, I guess, because we have a super majorities of Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate.
And that super majority is what enables them to often pass legislation that we're not even asked about. And that's why when you have to come to a place where voters have to defend themselves that way against elected policy officials who make this kind of policy, we have no other choice. There's a lot at stake.
We've got 2 minutes left, and I want to get in one more question that we have, and that's, if rideshare companies are only a platform, then how are they not profitable with 40 million rides monthly? David, do you have a business comment on that?
No, I welcome the fact that they're successful. I'd rather work with a company that is successful because the consumer wants it than a company that is struggling to meet payroll or a company that's gone because they couldn't navigate technology waters. I think the fact that these companies are successful doesn't make them bad. It makes them smart, and the people who are working to make them successful, it's a win-win.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're on a tight schedule today. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Gonzalez and David Cruz, for joining us. Lots more information. Go to calmatters.org for much more on this debate. Thanks.
Bye.